Thank you. Thank you. So it's good to be back here. Thank you to Salisbury School for providing the infrastructure for this, and for the forum for deciding to have me back after this many years. I remember very fondly speaking here about Pakistan so many years ago. And so I'm delighted that so many of you have come out. Thank you very much. There it is, the most troubled, the oldest, most conflicted region of the world. I never really intended to go and cover the Middle East. I remember when I was younger, I was covering Central America. Those were some of my first forays into foreign reporting. And I kept thinking in the Middle East, that would be just way too difficult and complicated and violent. But in 1998, when I formed Rain Media, as Frank mentioned, I picked up the paper one morning and there was a story about these two bombings in two embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And I thought, well, that's an interesting story. This guy who did it, whoever he is, or this organization, is going to be around for a while. I should look into that. And I called Frontline and I said, I'd like to do a story about this group, Al-Qaeda, that nobody really knew much about. And we got that show on the air and nobody paid a lot of attention. We did it with the New York Times. We had a front page story, but still it was kind of, it went by. Then on 9/11, I got a call from David Fanning, the executive producer of Frontline. He says, you know, I'm watching this film you made about this group Al-Qaeda. This is the afternoon of 9/11. He says, you know, it's pretty good. And then from there on out, I was drawn to covering Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the war in Iraq, and now my current work, which involves connecting the dots on the entire region. In the past, we've often gone out and covered a war here or a war there, the situation in one country or another, but I haven't had the opportunity to really get my head around the region as a whole and to try to understand the larger picture. And that's what we are doing in the current program. It's in your program, it's listed as The War Inside Islam. It's now called Bitter Rivals, and it's a look at the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran and all the fires that are burning as a consequence of that rivalry, proxy wars across the Middle East. In one way or another, they're on the opposite sides of wars, or have been in all the countries that are up there before you, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon, Pakistan, and more, Bahrain, I can go on. So this project will be 3 hours on the air in February, the first night, February 20th, and the second night, a week later, February 27th. And looks at this rivalry. When this project came about, because David Fanning, who is the founder and executive producer of Frontline, and my boss and colleague, and a man that I admire tremendously, decided to step down from being the executive producer of the series and to start to produce his own work. And he said, I want to do a program that explains the sectarianism that is burning across the Middle East, and just what is a Sunni and what is a Shia and what's their problem with each other, and asked me if I would come aboard this project. It was at that time 2 hours. It wasn't long before I said, I think it needs to be 3. The money ran out before I could get them up to 4. It would have been nice, but I was a little reluctant at the beginning because it was pitched as a look at sectarianism and this age-old enmity between Sunnis and Shias. And I think in the simplest understanding that some Americans have about this is that these people have been at each other's throats for 1,400 years, ever since 632, when there was a debate over the succession to the Prophet Muhammad. It's not quite that way. This current violence that we're seeing is a relatively new phenomenon, And it begins in 1979 with the revolution, the Khomeini revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini is coming to throw out the Shah and take Iran. Now, before I go into more, I want to show, we're in the middle of editing right now, and I wanted to show a segment of the program, but everything's a little bit disorganized, but we did make a pitch reel that we've used to sell the series to European broadcasters and to Japan. And so it's just a short 10-minute or so pitch reel, but it'll give you a sense of the breadth and scope of the series. So let me run that. On the edge of the Shia city of Najaf in southern Iraq is the world's largest cemetery, the Valley of Peace. 1,500 acres, 5 million bodies. The cemetery has been open for over 1,400 years. But today, many of the dead are victims of Iraq's more recent sectarian violence. Violence that has torn Iraq apart. Nearby is the shrine of Imam Ali, the son-in-law of Prophet Muhammad, one of the holiest sites in all of Shia Islam. Here, dozens of deceased Iraqis are carried past the tomb every day to receive Ali's blessing. The coffins draped with Iraqi flags are those of soldiers, either from the Iraqi army or from Iraq's paramilitary forces, the Shia militias, men who have died fighting ISIS. Militia leader Qais al-Khazali, who has never spoken to a Western TV reporter before, says the war on Iraq's Shia began with Saudi Arabian support for Sunni militant groups like Al-Qaeda.
كذلك اللي استثمر القاعدة أيضا هو السعودية بالدرجة الأساس، وكان يقتلون المدنيين والأطفال وعمليات الذبح.
A wave of car bombings this morning in and around Baghdad, attacking Shiite targets. Almost every day here, lives are being torn apart.
فكان هناك حرب إبادة مذهبية طائفية تستهدف الشيعة.
Khazali complains about Saudi meddling, yet his militia, the League of the Righteous, is sponsored and funded by Shia Iran.
إيران تدعم كل حركات المقاومة اللي موجودة في المنطقة. أن تكون لدى الشيعة علاقة مع إيران هذا شيء طبيعي، مثل ما أن تكون لدى السنة علاقة مع السعودية، هذا مسألة طبيعية.
Shia militias have now emerged as the victors in the new Iraq. I was in Baghdad on the day it was announced that ISIS had finally been driven out of Iraq's second largest city, Mosul.
Has been declared in the Iraqi city of Mosul.
This is what victory looks like.
What was once the capital in Iraq of ISIS's caliphate, now reduced to rubble around us here, the devastation of this city.
In city after city, it is Iraq's Sunnis who have borne the brunt of the fight. It was their cities that ISIS occupied. Places like Tikrit, Beji, Tal Afar, and Ramadi.
رمادي منكوبة وأعلن عنها منكوبة. 80% من ممتلكات المواطنين والبنى التحتية للدولة دمرت. كنا نعتقد
Ibrahim al-Austaj is Ramadi's mayor.
هذا حي البكر الآن يعني صار راح ننزل هسه بفد شوي. هذه أكثر العمليات العسكرية صارت هنا. دمرت هاي المنطقة بشكل كامل. راح ندخل الآن داخل المنطقة وأشوفكم الدمار الموجود بها.
Today, few have been able to return. Across Iraq, millions of Sunnis have been displaced from their homes. Tens of thousands are stuck in camps. Many Sunnis are suspected to be ISIS sympathizers.
ترحمونا الله يرحم بحالكم، لأن زوجها مو داعش ولا عنده اسم بالحاسبة، ما بيها داعم تلبين بيه. والأطفال هذول مرضى صار لهم شهر. ما مقصرين ويانا بخدمات، بس الجو حار ما نستحمل أكثر من هذا بعد.
Among Iraq's Sunnis, the anger that led to the emergence of ISIS is rising again. Militant Sunnis are now recruiting new fighters. The situation in Iraq is far from stable.
The Sunnis have suffered a lot and are suffering a lot. You can't put them and leave them in the camps. If we don't get these people back to their places, if we don't find them jobs, if we don't embark on getting rid of sectarianism, if we don't treat them as equal members of the Iraqi society, then I assure you, we will see something more virulent than ISIS in the future. I see it as a ticking bomb. It will explode in our faces if we don't change the environment.
Those scenes, filmed recently in Iraq, are part of an epic journey frontline reporter Martin Smith has been taking through the most war-torn region in the world, trying to understand the deep sectarian divisions, how they affect a major humanitarian crisis in Yemen, their role in a fractured Syria.
What's the situation there?
And a deeply divided Pakistan. Traveling from the Bekaa Valley with Hezbollah, the Party of God, to the tightly controlled Islamic Republic of Iran.
Who is this man we're going to see?
And inside the palaces of Saudi Arabia. Frontline traces the roots of the deadly divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims, their long history and theological differences, and the role two major countries play in the present-day strife.
It is a power struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia for dominance of the Muslim world.
The Shia feel threatened by Sunnis and Saudi Arabia.
Resentment many Iraqi Sunnis have towards the Shia-dominated government.
Is the Sunni-Shia divide about to explode wide open?
The Saudis insist that you are a hostile, belligerent, adventurous nation attempting to export revolution around the region. How do you respond?
Well, talk is cheap. Let's look at the actions. Saudis helped Saddam Hussein for 8 years. Saudis helped Al-Qaeda. Saudis are funding terrorists who are operating in eastern Iran. So they started this sectarian message, not us.
The Iranians say you've been busy supporting and exporting extremism. What's your response to that?
Nonsense. The Iranians are the ones who are exporting terrorism. They're the ones who are stoking the fires of sectarianism. And they are the ones who have been on an aggressive path since 1979.
From the Iranian Shia revolution that ignited the fire
Khomeini was the mastermind and the inheritor of Iran's Islamic Revolution.
To the threat felt in Saudi Arabia.
Khomeini described the rulers of the Gulf as being like the Shah, who must be toppled.
To the role of Western countries.
The United States, by being in bed with the Saudi ruling family, is involved in one way or another at all levels.
We try to understand the proxy battles supported by clerics and kings.
Iranian and Saudi citizens aren't the ones that are suffering. There's been over 1 million casualties in the Middle East over the last decade. They've been Syrian, they've been Yemeni, they've been Iraqi.
And ultimately, the dangers of escalation.
Both Shias and Sunnis have been killed.
As the rhetoric escalates, as the pressure escalates, as the proxy wars escalate, neither side seems to appreciate that they're destroying the region.
Filmed in 7 countries over the course of 2 years. A 3-hour Frontline special series.
This is not something that has been taking place in this form for the last 15, 16 centuries. The violence that we are seeing today is new. It is modern political violence.
So I show that so that you get a sense of the scope of the series. Indeed, it's been a privilege for me to go to all these countries from let me put the map up again. I'll put up a map that's a little easier to read. It's a little distorted, perhaps. This makes Yemen look quite large because we're shooting down low and up. But you know, for this program, we went to Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, spent a little bit of time in Qatar, UAE, and Yemen, as well as Djibouti, which you have to go through to get to Yemen. So it's been a privilege to be able to take all this in and try to make sense of what is happening rather than just reporting on one place. The series begins with the revolution that throughout the Shah, the Western-backed Shah, and when Khomeini came to power, he pledged his revolution to be an Islamic revolution, not a Shia revolution, even though he was a Shia cleric. He pledged that he was taking on the mantle of leader of the Muslim world. And in fact, in the beginning, across the Middle East, with so much enmity towards the United States and Europe for meddling in the region to no good effect in the view of many people, he was celebrated across the region. That revolution was seen as finally a country standing up for what is theirs. Communism, Arab nationalism, capitalism were all seen as having failed at the various countries in the region. And here was Ayatollah Khomeini coming up and in the name of Islam declaring his revolution. And so it was widely celebrated. But then he began to denounce all the monarchies that were friends with the United States, Saudi Arabia most prominent among them. And together with those threats of wanting to topple all monarchies, all Western-backed monarchies in the region, together with the sense that he was taking upon himself the leadership of the Muslim world, this was an enormous threat to Saudi Arabia, which is all about being the Saudi royal family is all about being the custodians of the two holiest places in all of Islam, the mosques of Mecca and Medina. So the revolution in Iran sets up a counter-reaction in Saudi Arabia, and from that has sprung this rivalry. Previously, Shia and Sunnis had differences, but over the centuries, they've mostly lived in peace. There's been a lot of intermarriage. But with this modern revolution in 1979, you have this launching of this virulent rivalry. At the same time, in 1979, there was a group of extremist Wahhabis, militants, who took over the Grand Mosque in Mecca. And their complaint was that Saudi Arabia wasn't religious enough, that the Wahhabis, who represent a branch of Sunni Islam that is extremely austere and harsh, conservative, fundamentalist, they said that Saudi Arabia had been moving in the wrong direction. At that time, in '79, the previous decade, women were on television with their heads with no headscarves. They were announcers on television. They were walking the streets without headscarves. Western goods were flooding into the country with petrodollars. There was a lot of liberalization going on. So combined with this event in this revolution in Iran and this takeover of the Grand Mosque, which lasted 2 weeks, the ringleader of it, a guy named Juhayman, was executed. But immediately after that, the Wahhabi clerics said, look, we're going in the wrong direction here. We need to pull back. We need to become more religious. And so Iran is doubling down on Shia Islam. Saudi Arabia begins to double down on their own brand of Sunni Wahhabi Islam. That same year, '79, the Saudis were taking their petrodollars and giving them to the clerics, and they were spreading that money around the world, building Wahhabi mosques and instructing people across Europe and America, everywhere. And then I think it was the next year, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and the Americans and the Saudis rushed in and began to support the most jihadi groups that they could. They subcontracted the whole job to the Pakistani military, which picked the most hardcore jihadi groups to lead that revolt. And we flooded money in there, a total of $6 billion, $3 billion from us, $3 billion from the Saudis. And out of that, of course, a lot of young Saudis went there. Among them was a young guy named Osama bin Laden, established Al-Qaeda. The war against the Soviets was won, but what we got in return was a lot of young men who, this is a familiar story perhaps to many of you, came back to their host countries, many of them to Saudi Arabia, and we had created a monster, essentially. At the same time, in Lebanon, Iran, Lebanon had long been a center of Shia'dom. There were Shia in Lebanon before they were in Iran, if you go back some hundreds of years. They started pumping money in to form a militia called Hezbollah, the Party of God. So Iran's got a project in Lebanon. They're successful where no Arab country had been successful, by defeating Israel, by pushing Israel out of southern Lebanon. Israel had invaded Lebanon in order to push out the Palestine Liberation Organization. They did that, they occupied the land. Hezbollah came along with money from Iran, pushed them out, and Hezbollah became, and Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, became heroes across the Middle East for having done what Arab governments had failed to do. So now you've got this rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. You've got these Pakistan as a petri dish for Sunni extremists, and in Lebanon you've built Hezbollah. Simultaneously, there's a war going on. Saddam Hussein decides that he's going to topple Khomeini. He thinks the government is weak, so he decides to invade Iran. All this is going on in the matter of 79, 80, 81, 82. The Iran-Iraq war gets very little coverage here. The Americans, however, are siding with Saddam Hussein. And the Saudis are pumping money in to support Saddam Hussein against Iran. The current generation that runs Iran, they fought in that war. If they didn't die in that war, many of them are now in government. They remember that war. That war may be a forgotten war to, or an unknown war to many Americans, but it is well remembered. It's a war that's fought to a kind of a stalemate. Saddam pushes into Iran, and Iran pushes into Iraq, and they end up, after 8 years and over 1 million deaths, coming to a kind of stalemate. But that war is remembered in that it was Saudi Arabia that lined up with Saddam Hussein against Iran, deepening that rivalry. The next big event that happens, of course, is the US invasion of Iraq. The US invasion of Iraq, the ill-fated invasion of Iraq, hands the control, by toppling Saddam Hussein, to the Shia of Iran. Iran moves quickly in. The Saudis had advised against it. They said, do not go take out Saddam. Saddam was their protector. He was the buffer between them and Iran. By going in up there, Iraq and Iran at the top of that map, by going into Iraq and toppling the government, it exposed Saudi Arabia to Iran in a way that they hadn't been before. Now Iran is right on their border, controlling Iraq. And that is the situation today. That is what we cover in the first 2 hours. It's enormously complex, but I'm very excited about the work that we've been doing in order to tell this story in a way that I think a lot of people will be able to grasp. In the second night, we look at the war in Syria. There's no place where the proxy war has claimed more lives than in Syria. Saudi Arabia funded the jihadist groups that were trying to topple Assad. America on their side. Obama was tepid about it. He didn't fully want to fund them. But the lineup is Saudi Arabia supporting jihadist groups, some of that money getting to groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, ISIS being a group that follows on after Al-Qaeda, and the Iranians sending in Hezbollah from Lebanon into Syria, as well as bringing Shia militia groups to fight the Saudi proxy armies, as well as even Afghan militia, Shia. So that's a country where you had more proxy armies fighting, funded by Iran on one side and Saudi Arabia on the other than any other. And the death toll, I don't even know how these figures are how people come up with these figures, but the word is it's something like 400,000 to 500,000 dead. I just came back from Syria about 10 days ago. It's now accepted that Assad is going to stay in power, that the American-Saudi effort has failed, and the Saudis have pretty much decided to walk away from it. But now a new young crown prince, around 30 years old, I think he's 32 now, maybe 31, 32, has decided that it is Yemen where he's going to stop Iran. I met with him in a midnight session at the Yamama Palace in Riyadh back in February. And I asked him how this rivalry was going to resolve, and he said, well, we're gonna beat them in Yemen. Unfortunately, the Saudi bombs have now been dropping on the heads of the Yemenis for, I think it's 3 years now, and there's no end in sight. The Iranians are giving some support. They don't really need to give much support. They're on the same side as the Houthi rebels who have taken over northern Yemen, but they are doing it on the cheap, whereas the Saudis are spending billions of dollars with a bombing campaign that has not yet worked. One of the things I'm very proud of is that we were able to get into all these countries. And Yemen is a particularly difficult place to operate as a reporter. We were the only American reporters to get in there in the last year. And hats off to my associate producer who managed to get us visas, both from the Houthi rebels that received some Iranian backing, and the Saudis. We were there in May, and the program isn't going out until February, and we decided that we couldn't witness the humanitarian disaster that we were witnessing and sit on that footage. So we put together a film that aired in July on Frontline, and I want to show a 6-minute excerpt from that film about the situation there. People often ask why the Saudis are bombing Yemen. It's a question for the Saudis. They'll tell you they're fighting against the rebel group that's trying to take over the country, who are backed by their arch rival, Iran. Yet, in the time I was there, it was hard to see, really, what the Iranians were doing. But the impact of the Saudi-led coalition bombing was very clear. Parts of the country have been isolated because of bomb strikes on bridges. People on the ground in Yemen are suffering. They're caught in the crossfire of this war. In Hajjah, we went to a hospital, and I met a nurse there who showed me pictures she had taken a day or two before of a young boy who came in severely malnourished and died.
تتأثر وتزعل عليه لأن إحنا بنقوم بالواجب ونضل نحبه وفي الآخر يتوفى علينا ما يصبرش هذا.
She then was called away to go take care of a new severe malnutrition patient. A mother came in with her child. It was a little girl named Aline, a 7-month-old baby.
أكيد مشكلة الحرب، ما أنا مشكلة الحرب عامل أساسي سوء التغذية، وبتزداد من بعد الحرب. ازدادت سوء التغذية الحالات، ما عاد فيش تغذية. كيف معيشتكم في البيت؟ ما فيش.
There were always malnutrition cases in Yemen, but the nurse told us that the number of cases had more than doubled since the war. Then maybe an hour later, another mother came in with her daughter. Ruqayya, her name was a 5-year-old girl. Ruqayya had come from a IDP, an internally displaced persons camp that was quite a ways away up near the Saudi border, traveled several hours because the hospital up near her had been bombed.
يعني عندهم مثلا في منطقة نائية ما بيش معاهم مواصلات، ما بيش معاهم زلط إنه بنتيجة الكوارث هذه ما بيش معاهم زلط إنه تنقلهم من منطقتهم للمنطقة اللي موجودة. مكانهم لهنا يضطروا إنهم يجلسوا.
والله من ناحية بنفسر الحال بيصير للأسوأ. احنا بنقول في أمل إنه يصير للأحسن بس بيصير للأسوأ. الأمراض بتزيد وسوء التغذية بتزيد. مع الحروب بتشتد لأن ما بيخففوش الضرب على اليمن. بكله بيتحول في الأطفال.
And who do you blame for the war?
على الحرب. والله من ناحية الشعب ومن ناحية الدولة الخارجية اللي قامت تهجم على البلاد. هكذا يعني من الجانبين. أدي هي بدها تضرب الضعفاء. ما بدها تضرب غير الضعفاء فقط لأني ما بش هجوم غير الأقوياء، ما بش ضعفاء هنا فقط. الفقراء والمساكين داخل اليمن.
We had to leave the hospital before we knew what the fate of the girls was going to be. I don't know what happened to them. All I do know is that health workers in Yemen say that every 10 minutes a child dies of preventable causes. Americans may not be aware of American involvement in the war in Yemen, but Yemenis in Sana'a and in northern Yemen certainly know where the weapons are coming from. Just a few days after we arrived, there was a huge rally in the middle of Sana'a called the Say No to American Terrorism rally. Thousands gathered to protest the arrival of President Trump in Riyadh, where he announced his intention to approve a $110 billion arms package to the Saudis.
We respect the United States of America and we hold a respect in our hearts, but we came here in order to express our outrage against the United States policy.
It was pretty evident that we were an American TV crew, but absolutely no hostility was directed at us. There was only a sense that our government was to blame, and ordinary Yemenis want the world to be aware of what's going on. A lot of people have asked me how we got in, because every news organization that I know of has been trying. There have been some British journalists to get in. One is a Yemeni reporter, a Yemeni Brit. I mean, she grew up in Yemen, works for the BBC in London, and she's been able to get in. It's easy for a woman to land in a place far away from the capital and cover herself and drive in. Myself, I look like I work for the CIA. It's a little harder for me to manage. I think we called the Saudis bluff. We had spent time in Saudi Arabia earlier in the year, and we kept saying to them, you know, you say it's what's going on in Yemen is X, and we don't know, you should allow us to go there. And they would say, yeah, you can go there, you can go there. And finally, we cornered them. The head of the Saudi intelligence services, the Muhabarat, in a restaurant in Manhattan. We took him out to dinner and got him to say, yeah, he would get us in. And I think they wanted to have us go in so they could say, we don't prevent people from going in. The truth is, they do. There's no other American team that's been able to get in, and they like it that way. these numbers that are up there, 10,000 dead or 7 million facing famine, have stayed sort of static. The UN doesn't really have a grasp on exactly the scope of this, but it's a country of about 28 to 30 million people. And 7 million people are facing famine, and something like, according to the UN, they use this term, food insecure. This is people who don't quite know where their next meal is going to come from, and that number's around 18 million out of 28. So it's a really serious situation. The cholera cases, the starvation, and the incessant bombing campaign that seems to have produced very little. I've stayed in touch with the Saudis. I have a texting relationship with both the head of the intelligence service, who complained quite a bit on texts about this piece, but he stayed in touch, as well as the Crown Prince. Up until recently, we were texting on a fairly regular basis. The last act of our film, of course, deals with the arrival of Trump in Riyadh. It sort of follows on from where this left off, and announcing that he wants to reverse the nuclear deal in Iran, and he wants to tighten, reestablish America's alliance with Saudi Arabia, tilting back to Saudi Arabia. And the young Crown Prince, who is, maybe I'll talk over here. Is this better? That one keeps cutting out. The young Crown Prince, who now has arrested more than 100 clerics and princes and billionaires and put them in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel as prisoners, and is attempting to secure his path to power. I don't quite see how that's going to play out. He's creating a lot of enemies, and it's not at all clear if this is going to work. So the situation has gone from bad to worse. The Saudi reaction to the Iranian Revolution had them double down on Wahhabism. The Iranians have moved into supporting various groups, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah in Lebanon. And these two countries with their proxy forces are going at one another. We saw what happened in Syria with the eruption of sectarianism, as well as in Syria. So I don't have good news because I think this hasn't played out yet. And now with the United States securing its alliance with the Saudis, it's not clear to me how that is going to help. So I'll leave you with that and answer any questions that you might have. And I hope I haven't confused everybody. Thank you very much. Please, there are no bad questions. It's an enormously complicated region. And I hope I haven't confused you with this. And I hope you are tantalized enough to tune in February.
Two short questions. One, what is Russia's role in this play seems to be? And the other one, what is Israel's place in this turmoil?
Yeah, those are both good questions. You could also ask, what's Turkey's role in this, and some other countries. Russia became involved in September of 2015 in supporting the Assad government in Syria. What Russia wants are bases on the Mediterranean, and they got that. They have air bases and ports. They're not particularly interested in doing a lot of on-the-ground work. When I was in Syria recently, Iran was building schools. The Russians weren't really coming in with reconstruction money. So Russia's relationship with Iran is also strained. So I think Russia wants to have a place in the region. I think they want their warm water ports on the Mediterranean, but I don't see them getting involved on the ground. And there are some Russian soldiers in Syria, but it's not a huge presence. Israel's enemy is Iran, feels that threat very, they were defeated by Hezbollah, which is an agent of Iran. Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, says we get everything we eat, everything we use, all our weapons, everything, 100% from Iran. Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. And Israel fears them. And so Israel has improved its relationship with Saudi Arabia and has lined up on that side of the fence. There's worry in Israel about the Golan Heights, that now that Syria has defeated ISIS, more or less, that they will turn their attention with Hezbollah and Shia militias from Iraq to mounting some kind of action on the Golan Heights. I don't know how true that is, but that's the fear that Israel has.
There were three things that I didn't hear you mention. Is it because you think they're sort of irrelevant, and that is, one, the U.S. involvement originally way back in overthrowing the Mossadegh government. The second is the fact that the United States supported Iran during the Iran-Iraq war by resupplying them with spare parts and other things for their equipment, which they all inherited from the Shah, which we supplied to the Shah in the first place. And finally, Desert Storm, as though that was of no relevance in what's happened since.
All those things are important. The Mossadegh incident in 1953, whereby a democratically elected parliament in Iran elected a prime minister who decided to nationalize the British-owned oil business, and the CIA, together with the Brits, engineered a coup to throw him out. That is key history. It's very much a part of the documentary. And I didn't mention it only because of time and trying to get through a complicated region. The resupply of Iranian, giving the Iranians parts, the bulk of American help was to Saddam, even in that Iran-Iraq war. The Americans and the Saudis were, you're shaking your head no, but they wanted a balance. They were happy to see these two countries go at each other and destroy each other. But the bulk of the help that was given was on the Iraqi side. And the third point was?
Desert Storm.
Desert Storm. We deal with that in that in the wake of Desert Storm, a decision was made not to go to Baghdad by George Bush Sr., but he at the same time encouraged a Shia uprising, which was taken to heart by the Shia in southern Iraq, and we cover this in the program. And of course, it's a very sad tale where George Bush Sr. encourages this uprising, and then it's brutally put down by Saddam, and America does nothing. So that, again, contributed to sectarian tension in the region. We cover that. I'll let you decide I'm letting them decide.
Could you explain what Saudi Arabia hopes to gain by conquering Yemen, by bombing and starting, if I understand the end game there?
Well, it's that they fear that Iran is getting a foothold on their southern border. It's also that this point right here, called the Bab el-Mandab, Bab being door, but it's a very narrow channel between Djibouti and Yemen. It controls the Red Sea access. They don't want that falling into Iran's hands. For a long time, the Houthis were sort of an annoyance on their southern border, but when they took power, the Saudis saw Iranian involvement. Most all diplomats that you talk to and experts on the region will say that the Saudis are exaggerating. And I do believe that Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, when he launched this war, was looking for a quick victory, thought it would take 2 months, and now he's 3 years in. When I talked to Adel Jubeir, the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, about this, and I said, you seem like you're a little bogged down, I said to him, in that war. He says, we're not bogged down at all. You've been fighting in Afghanistan for how many years? And you know, I said, well, that's a very low bar. I don't know if you want to use that as an example, the longest war in US history. So the Saudis are bogged down, but they fear. And bin Salman has to now, he's in a difficult position because in order to sell that war to the other members of the royal family and to the Saudi public, he has to say Iran is there in ways that they're not. They're there in a, it doesn't cost the Iranians much to help the Houthi rebels, you know, fire a missile here or there. But there's nothing compared to the bombing campaign that Saudi Arabia is launching. But they can't win, really, without going in on the ground. And the Saudis don't really have an army that would do that. I mean, they're going to have to hire Bangladeshis or Filipinos to do that for them. I don't know where the mics are. Oh, we're up there. Okay.
You mentioned at the end that you don't quite see how Trump aligning with Saudi Arabia is going to play out positively. So, presuming that you fear that it might be a negative thing, how, as a journalist, one for a large organization like NPR, how do you play that out in your program to not show bias, or do you show some bias? And then how would it be different if you were individually, as a journalist, publishing an article or something on it?
That's an interesting question, and I have in the next few weeks to face it in the edit room.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is, as a journalist, how do I report fairly without bias on the decision being made by Trump to throw in his lot with the Saudis, presumably because there's a presumption that I don't see that as necessarily constructive development. So the question is, how do I therefore report on this? Am I getting your question correctly? Yeah. And be fair at the same time. Look, I think that there's no right side in this war between these two protagonists across the Middle East, and we're destroying the region by having these countries go at each other the way they are. So I think for us to take sides is not a good thing. I think we have to be seen as an interlocutor that is has the best interests of both the country we're dealing with and the region. And it's a difficult one. It's difficult to deal with Iran because they march around saying death to America all the time. I talk to them about that in the program. I say, you know, why don't you drop the rhetoric and, you know, we could talk to each other. But their whole compact with their public is that they're anti-American. That's their revolution. That's the meaning of it. It's anti-Western. It's about Islam and their pride. It is a very difficult question, and I just think that we have to be not just falling back on old policies of backing monarchs in the region. Look, I think the Iranians have great pride, rightly so, in their revolution. It doesn't mean they also haven't been up to mischief and been destabilizing the region. Backing Assad is a really, it's very troubling. So I have to face this question and try to find my way through the thicket, and that's what I will be doing in my edit room over the next a month and a half.
Could you comment on probably something that's not at the forefront of all this internecine battle, but could you comment on what in the world will ever happen to the Kurds?
You know, the last program I did was called Confronting ISIS. And I spent a fair amount of time interviewing Brett McGurk, who is in charge of the US war against ISIS. And of course, his chief ally in that war, when you're talking about, well, his chief ally in that war were the Kurds. The Kurds were sacrificing men and women in the battle to fight ISIS. And I pressed him and I said, so what are the Kurds getting out of this? The Kurds have had their hopes raised in the past and we have disappointed them. Okay, this time they're expecting something out of this, so what are you going to do? And he got very, this is not the time to discuss this. And I said, well, it's not. So I'm not sure what your question is. I just don't know what we're going to do for the Kurds other than potentially walk away. Look, nobody likes the Kurds in the region. The Turks are afraid of them, the Syrians are afraid of them, the Iranians, and the Iraqis. And they're just trying to carve out a piece of land that crosses all those borders, but that gives them a lot of powerful enemies. It's a huge question that has to be addressed, and I haven't seen, nor do I expect this administration to address such a difficult problem. So we have to wait. Maybe a few weeks we'll have a new administration, I don't know. There was a question right down here. Do we have a microphone? Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for shedding light on such a complex issue. I really appreciate it. Just Mike, I had a couple questions. One is,
oh, there you are.
Right here. Yeah, thank you. I'd love to hear your take on the Hariri resignation and then his backtracking on that and what you think drove that. And secondly, I'd be interested in your thoughts on what do you think the biggest challenges bin Salman has. Do you think it's the Shia relationship with Sunni, or is it the inter-Sunni relationship with the Wahhabis? How does he deal with that?
Well, I'll take the back half of that, the back part of that question first. I mean, I think he is challenging the Wahhabist clerics. He's really, I mean, he announced before this round of arrests, you know, he announced that women were going to have the right to drive. When I met with him back in February, I said, you know, the clerics, you pay them, they all work for you. So why can't you just announce tomorrow that you're going to say women can drive? And he said, oh, you can't do it that quickly. You can't, you know, there's the religious street. It will rise up against you. And I said, really? I mean, nobody has the freedom to demonstrate here. I mean, they quash, I mean, I tried to film a demonstration there that I'd gotten with some opposition figures on another trip, and it lasted seconds. And our cameras were taken as well. And we spent a day and a half trying to get our cameras back. So they have control, and I think he has sent the Mutawa, the religious police, pretty much back to the barracks. I mean, I did hear today that they were out there acting in a recent report, I think, on one of the networks. But I think he's taken them on, and Saudi society is very young, and I think he can make progress there. Although what we're talking about is reform from the top down, and yeah, that's kind of what China has done and you know, other places, but it's hard. And I don't know that it's real change if it's just sort of dictated from above. What was the first part of that question? Oh yeah, the Hariri hostage video. So to those of you who are not familiar, so a few weeks ago, the Prime Minister Hariri of Lebanon was called to Saudi Arabia, and then went on with a prepared speech that almost every Lebanese that I was in Lebanon at the time, all the Lebanese that I spoke to in various coffee shops where they were watching all this go on, said that that wasn't the way he spoke. It sounded to them like a put-up job by the Saudis. But now he's gone back. So I don't know the inner workings of that. I can't answer as to why he's now back as prime minister. But obviously it was demonstrated that the Saudis can pull strings. The Saudis wanted him to resign because they didn't want him to continue to perform as a fig leaf, making it seem as if there was a power-sharing arrangement in Lebanon, when in fact Hezbollah has the balance of power. But now he's back, and so, you know, Salman may have decided he needed to slow down. I don't know.
Can you comment on Egypt's position on all of this, and especially their deal that was announced in today's Times, allowing the Russians air bases in Egypt?
Yeah, no, I read that, and I got to say that I haven't paid. I covered the Arab Spring in Egypt, and then the crackdown on Morsi, but I really haven't kept up. I've had a hands full just covering these other 7 countries. And I don't read every article or know everything. I did see that article in the Times today, and I just think that's bumbling on the part of a State Department and an administration where nobody is home. And so the Russians have filled the vacuum. That's what it struck me as. I didn't even read the article, and there may have been people in that article saying that same thing. I don't know.
Your title is Proxy Wars, and that implies great powers, like the beginnings of World War I, great powers stirring up problems elsewhere and using these nationalist groups. Who is driving, who's proxy to whom?
Well, it's Saudi Arabia with its support for jihadist groups in Syria, for example, Arar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam. These are jihadi groups that are just a little bit this side of al-Qaeda and ISIS. It's Iran supporting Hezbollah and Shia militia, whether they're from Afghanistan or from Iraq. But it's not all proxy wars. I mean, Saudis are directly involved in Yemen. That's not a proxy. Those are their jets, together with the UAE and some other countries, and supplied by the United States. So that was the title for this talk. But the title for the series is Bitter Rivals, and I think that I'm comfortable with that as describing the overarching problem here. That these
so you
two.
don't see the great powers, meaning us, Russia, China, any.
They're playing roles. Yeah, the U.S. plays a role. The U.S. has made some great mistakes. I mean, the Mossadegh incident is probably right up there. The U.S. invasion of Iraq, the unleashing of sectarianism in Iraq. Let me make a point that I don't know that I've made clearly. I see this as a struggle between 2 regional powers, with Russia and America, China not so much, involved in taking sides at various times. But basically, it's this enmity between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I do not see sectarianism as the driver. I see that religion is weaponized by the Iranians and by the Saudis for their uses, so that soldiers on the street are killing one another in the name of Imam Hussein, or saints on the Shia side, or in the name of Wahhabism and their beliefs. But it is cynically being driven by those either ayatollahs or kings that have regional ambitions or feelings of insecurity that they need to act. And so they employ religion to get people to fight, to motivate armies.
I wanted to ask you a question about the importance of oil. Isn't oil really the elephant in the room when it comes to U.S. support for Saudi Arabia? Ever since the sanctions have crippled Iran's capability to export oil, and Venezuela is in difficult shapes right now, the petrodollars generated from the oil in Saudi Arabia and their importance in OPEC really has affirmed U.S. support for them. And that's all the time. If you go back 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it's been the oil that has driven U.S. support for Saudi Arabia. And that's the reason we're in there tight with them. Whether that's good or bad, that's our belief for this country. And we don't want another oil crisis, an oil shock that we had several years back during the Carter administration. And I think that's the point that you really should make very, very strongly as to the motivation for why we're there. Whether that's good or bad, that's the motivation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, but most right historically. I think today our dependence on Saudi oil, our need for Saudi oil is less than it used to be. We have other sources here, whether it's shale or whether, we are not as beholden to the Saudis as we used to be. I think in the sort of great make America great again, there's this idea that you go back to the Saudis and you patch up that age-old relationship. And I don't know how much Trump is thinking about oil or just what, but we also, I mean, the whole war in Iraq was, a lot of that was about oil, because we wanted to get free of Saudi oil. Oil plays a role, for sure, but I don't see oils as important as it was 40 years ago.
The only comment I would make to that is that even if our imports of Saudi oil have declined, the marginal pricing of oil is really what rules the whole oil supply in the chain, because it's priced worldwide, and that's the issue that you really have to remember in terms of talking about economics.
No, that's absolutely right. I remember sitting in the Pentagon for a briefing around the time of the U.S. invasion, and having an official in the Pentagon explain this very thing to me, that if you could bring Iraq into our fold, you could control the price of oil by just controlling it at the margins. I understand.
So do you believe America should have a role in the Middle East? And if so, it doesn't sound like you think Saudi Arabia and Iran should be part of that. So if so, what actors, either non-state like the Kurds or the SDF, or state actors, would you want America to ally itself with?
I think we should be in there diplomatically with our sleeves rolled up, dealing with both of those countries. I do not think that we should be not engaging with Saudi Arabia. I don't think we should be not engaging with Iran. I just don't think we should be saying we're going to engage with Saudi Arabia and exclude Iran, or vice versa. So I do think America has a role to play. I don't think America, given its power and economic strength, can avoid being involved in the Middle East. So I just think that we are making a bit, I mean, my personal opinion is we're making a mistake if we're not in there working with all parties. As a fair broker. But taking sides in these battles, I don't think is going to help resolve much.
Thank you very much.